Withering Rooms is a brand new indie survival horror game that looks to reinvent the genre by combining multiple different subgenres into one. Even though the game has been in early access for over a year now, the full official release of it will be later this week on April 5th. However, thanks to Moonless, Formless, and Perp Games, I was able to get my hands on the full PS5 version of the game early and give you guys my honest thoughts on this new survival horror RPG prior to its release. With this year turning out to be the year of indie horror games, the question then becomes, how does it compare to the competition? Are there any elements of this game that remind me of Resident Evil and Silent Hill? And would I recommend picking this game up at release? Well, on this episode of Nerd Space Games, I'm going to answer all of those questions and more as I dive into Withering Rooms. Let's get it. Withering Rooms follows Nightingale, a young woman that has somehow found herself inside a dream world of a Victorian mansion. In this world, the player will come across monsters, zombies, vampires, witches, and other demonic creatures straight out of your nightmares. Quite literally, actually, since this is a dream world. Taking elements from different subgenres, Withering Room proves to be one of the more unique horror games that I've played this year. Starting with the fact that it's a side-scrolling, roguelike survival horror RPG. I know, that's a lot of subgenres for this game, but honestly, it really fits into each of these categories. As Nightingale, you'll learn that dying in this dream doesn't necessarily mean that you'll die for good. Instead, after you die, you then wake back up in your bed. Except for a couple of things have changed. First off, as a roguelike game, dying in Withering Rooms will cause you to lose most of your items that you've gathered. This includes weapons, spells, money, etc. Of course, there are ways to prevent this, such as unlocking shrines with disturbing sacrifices or finding items that are considered permanent. On top of losing your items though, the more significant change is the map. Outside of a couple key locations, most of the mansion will change. Enemies will respawn, your map will be wiped clean, and you'll need to learn what room is located where all over again. Because of this, Withering Rooms proves to be one of the more unique survival horror games out there, as it'll constantly keep you on your toes, and you'll find that death is not the end, it's just a bitch. Moving towards the combat and the gameplay, you'll see that it's not like your traditional survival horror game. Instead, it feels more like a combination of a side-scroller, Metroid Vania game, and RPG, as it takes elements from all three areas to create a fun and addictive combat system. Throughout the game, the player will learn of different resources that Nightingale could use to her advantage. And just like a traditional RPG game, the player can choose to go different routes by creating a build that fits their own personal preferences. For example, the witches in the game can help Nightingale learn new spells and improve her stats to help her become the ultimate spellcaster. You can gain access to guns like a shotgun and even a flamethrower to make quick work of enemies while keeping them at a distance. Or you can go the more traditional badass route of picking up a lead pipe or a cleaver and just beating the hell out of your enemies until they die. Either way, the gameplay offers different abilities and resources to help enhance your playstyle. This includes the use of artifacts, rings, and armor to help improve your stats. The combat is pretty simple and easy to get the hang of, as it takes the form of a side-scrolling Metroid Vania game with the use of 2D graphics, or as the developers like to point out, 2.5D. Honestly, I'm not a major technical person, so I don't completely understand what that means, but the way you explore the constantly changing rooms of the mansion was exciting and fresh no matter how many times I died. Speaking of which, one mechanic that allowed the world of Withering Rooms to stay fresh throughout my many visits came from the curse mechanic. Whether you are attacked by enemies, the use of spells, or just finding yourself in haunted locations, Nightingale can build up her curse status. As she becomes more and more cursed, the world around her changes. For one, the atmosphere around Nightingale becomes darker, haunted, and overall more terrifying as the curse changes Nightingale's perception of reality. However, one benefit of this comes from the fast travel mechanic. Since the mansion and the grounds around the mansion are massive and constantly changing each time you die, Withering Rooms introduces a way to fast travel around the map quickly using mirrors. Unfortunately, the only way to use these mirrors is to be cursed. Once cursed, the mirror will shatter a bit, revealing a hole that'll allow you to reach a new area, giving you access to fast travel. But be warned, building up too much curse will cause the curse rod status, which then deals damage until you recover from your curse by using a candle. Withering Rooms is a very challenging game in multiple ways. First off, every enemy in the game poses a significant threat to the player, even early game enemies. As the game progresses, however, things continue to get more difficult as Withering Rooms introduces witches that can cast spells, undead creatures that can shoot guns, and even spirits that you can't see unless you're cursed or your perception is high. However, most of the enemies can be dealt with fairly easily once you get the hang of the combat. As I started to lean more heavily on a spellcaster build, I found myself enchanting suits of armor and using fireballs to make quick work of difficult enemies. And at one point, I hired a mercenary to help me eliminate all of the enemies inside the mansion so that I could go collect all the resources without any issues. But where the game gets really difficult are the boss fights, since most of them will make quick work of suits of armor and they move faster than you can cast spells. Dealing with them quickly before they kill you proved to be extremely hard in some cases. Actually, full disclosure, it literally took me 20 tries to beat this boss on screen right now after trying different strategies against it until one eventually succeeded. Luckily, for those that can't seem to get past certain fights, Withering Rooms does allow you to change between standard and narrative difficulty throughout the game without any issues except for the map being reset again. And prior to each boss fight, there is a checkpoint that the player can set in the event that they die. Instead of losing all of their resources, they'll revive back at that checkpoint like nothing happened. As a survival horror game, there are of course puzzles for you to solve, most of which are pretty creative and difficult to solve. Actually, there was one that I couldn't figure out. I don't know if it was a glitch, but I felt like I solved it correctly, but the organ wouldn't allow me to click the correct keys. Regardless, most of the puzzles were solvable, and even if you did have difficulty with some of them, and you became frustrated, some merchants sold an item that would allow you to skip the puzzle completely. The last couple of things that I want to cover before moving on are the story and the replayability of the game. Straight up, I feel like the story is probably where the game suffers the most. Withering Rooms tries to throw twists and turns at you to keep you intrigued with the story, but overall I found myself not really caring for the characters and how everything was going to turn out. Sure, no voice acting definitely didn't help, but honestly, after seeing Dino Break use AI voice acting, I definitely preferred this method instead. But while the story wasn't that interesting to me, the amount of lore and side quests to find throughout the game was. In a game like this, I wasn't expecting to find myself wanting to explore as much, yet here I was spending hours exploring the entire map over and over again in an effort to find and do everything that this game had to offer. Even in New Game Plus, Withering Rooms offers a unique side quest available to that playthrough of the game. So even without a satisfying story, I still found myself intrigued by the world of Withering Rooms to the point where I found myself lost in it for hours at a time. And in my first playthrough, probably because of the amount of times that I died, I took roughly 10 hours to complete on standard difficulty. Then I revisited the game in New Game Plus and found myself spending even more time on it. Withering Rooms is one of the most unique horror games that I've ever played. The fact that this game tries to combine so many different subgenres into a survival horror game wasn't something that I expected to work well, yet it did. Sure, there are a few issues with the game. The story is boring, the combat isn't exactly the most inventive combat in a side-scroller, and there were definitely some issues with balancing for some of the player's abilities late in the game. But overall, I found myself really enjoying this game a lot, to the point where it's definitely one of my favorite horror games of the year. Perhaps my favorite one thus far. So with that in mind, I have to give Withering Rooms an 8 out of 10. Honestly, I even considered moving it up higher. If the game was a little more fleshed out, if the combat was a little more creative and polished, and if the story of the game was a little more interesting with better dialogue, then I could easily see it bumping up into that 9 territory. Anyway, that's it for today's episode of Nerdspace Games. Hit up the comments if you have any questions about this game, and I'll be sure to answer them as soon as possible. Also, don't forget to leave a like on today's video and subscribe for more survival horror content. But as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerdspace Games. Take care.